All right. Hello and welcome to the free lunch, a moment when I like to meet up for a lunchtime and have a lunchtime chat with somebody interesting. And that somebody interesting that I have with me today is an old friend of mine, Matthew Brown, who is the boss of something called Being, Thinking, Doing. And I would very much like to introduce him to you and for him to tell us what he does.
Thanks, Eddie. Um, yeah, happy to do so, and great to be here. Thanks for what am I, the third, fourth, fifth guest on the show, something like that. So
You're the third.
great to be in early. So my company's called Being, Thinking, Doing. Just to give a quick minute on what that means. It's a great name for a company, but what does it actually mean in practice? So for about 15 years, I've worked in the area we used to call productivity. I don't really like the name productivity. It makes it sound like machines. I prefer to call it personal and professional effectiveness, but you know what we're talking about, doing the right thing, doing it well. And in that time, I've sort of gradually realized there's something missing in this, which is if we focus on what we're doing and how we're doing it, we're missing the bit which comes before, which is what goes on up here. So there's the doing bit, which is productivity, if you like. But before that, there's the thinking bit. And this is all about cognition, how we can avoid cognitive biases, have strategies and practices for making good decisions and thinking straight. And if we got that, we're going to be fine. But then it occurred to me there's a bit missing before that as well, which is what goes on inside us. So, what are the values and internal rules that guide how we see the world and what we think of it? And I like to think these three things being, thinking, doing are kind of three sides of a coin, if that makes sense. But they're all
Absolutely.
interrelated. So, all the work I do now, which is mainly coaching, training, and consulting for organizations, dips into one of those three things.
Mhm.
And it seems to be working well.
Good, fantastic. Well, as you may have spotted in my book, which I believe you have read, so thank you very much for doing that. And he's going to show it. There it is. Um, I talk about this belief I have, which is that we only control ourselves. And in fact, it's a bit of a myth, this idea that we control anybody else. Of course, we control how we react to other people and how we react to situations. And I think sounds to me like you are coming at your work and your relationships with your clients in a similar way of working on that control of ourselves. Would that be fair?
Yeah. So, just thinking about the first one of being, thinking, and doing. Um, the reference point for a lot of the work that I do on this is the ancient philosophy of Stoicism. Right? So the
Mhm.
Greeks and Romans talked about this a lot, and actually, it seems to be a theme running through your book. I thought was quite interesting. It seemed to be, um, I don't know whether you consciously put it in there or subconsciously. So one of the things they talk about is one of the guiding principles of Stoicism is what's down to me and what's not down to me.
Mhm.
So the idea being that I have to stop worrying too much about other people's stuff. Let's start with me. And when I'm fully sorted out, I can be an effective person, but also an effective leader.
Right.
And I think this, you see this echoing in quite a lot of management thinking at the moment. So there's the circle of competence
Mhm.
idea, which I think is a Stephen Covey idea, where he talks about circle of interest, circle of influence, circle of control.
Mhm.
And the most effective leaders I know really have a strong focus on getting their act together,
Right.
really self management before they can even think about managing other people.
Mhm.
And the least effective leaders I've come across tend to really be projecting outwards other people's deficiencies,
Right.
which is simply a mirror of their own. It's kind of
Yeah.
an interesting thing. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think it's completely true. And I think that it's interesting, isn't it, how when you ask somebody, well, what happened? If they immediately move to external factors to explain something that went wrong, and they don't talk about themselves or the things that they actually do control, it indicates that they're sort of on a path where they're looking for reasons why things are going wrong outside themselves.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I think it's certainly true. And if I think about, so talked about some recent experiences I've had. So one of the things I talk about quite a lot is how we model calm or panic within an organization, right?
Right.
So, first thing we have to establish is what's urgent, what's important. I don't know if you've talked about this before, but
Yeah.
you're a native English speaker. Can you give me a working definition of what does urgent mean and what does important mean?
Oh, interesting. Well, urgent means it has to be done immediately, and important means that it has to be done, definitely done, and probably done well. Not necessarily right now.
I'm going to give you an A grade. I'm going to give you an A
Thank
grade for
you.
that. I'll put you on the
Oh,
spot.
you're
It's your
fantastic.
show, and I'm here to torture you in various ways. So, yeah, that's absolutely right. So, boil it down a little bit. Um, Important means this needs to be done right, and urgent means that it needs to be done right now.
Okay.
And people get these completely different things, right?
Yeah.
Important is about quality and impact, and urgent is about time. But people get them really confused. People say, this has come from the boss. Stop what you're doing. Do it. Stop what you're doing. Do it straight away.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense, right? This has
Yeah.
come from the boss. Do it properly once.
Hmm.
Makes sense. So, in a world where I would argue everyone is a little bit overreactive in the
Yeah.
workplace, particularly, good bosses are able to differentiate between these two things. So, let me give you two case studies, if you like. I work with a
Hmm.
big, large charity, and it doesn't feel calm, right? The work
Hmm.
they do takes a long time. It has significant social impact. It costs a lot of money. It takes forever. But they're all running around like headless chickens all the time. And I really struggled to work out why this was. And I
Hmm.
said, what are your values around your work? And one of them was act with urgency.
Ah,
I thought that
interesting.
was really interesting because nothing they ever do is urgent, but they just got to. So I think what the values say is let's pretend everything's urgent, even though it isn't. And what that leads to within the organization is an interesting thing where all their work's important, none of it's urgent. But because they're so busy reacting to each other,
Yeah.
they never get round to properly doing the important work.
Yeah.
So that's a case study of, if you like, a misalignment. And it's really quite, I think, I wouldn't say all the leadership, but some of the leadership doesn't address this thing.
Hmm.
And then there's a converse example I might give. Some work I did a few years ago with an organization. It was an agency, and I went to meet them in their offices in London, and I'd spoken to them before, and it felt like a really fast-moving, almost
Hmm.
like a trading floor environment. And I walked in there, and the whole thing just felt really calm. There's no noise.
Hmm.
People getting on with their work. I thought this is marvelous. And I said to the client contact, I said, "What's going on? Why is it so quiet?" And she said, "Oh, here we are calm by choice."
Right.
And I thought it was a really interesting thing. I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, look, if we allow the technology and the needs of clients to make us run around like maniacs all day long, we're just going to lose our minds. So we
Yeah.
have to manage expectations about responsiveness. We have to act calmly."
I
So I
got
think
a
there's two good examples.
I got very good examples. I got a couple of questions that I've been thinking about while you have been saying that. One of them is to do with technology and the sort of modern tools that
Mm.
we all have. And so I think back to my own career. I mean, email was bad enough that, and I got to the point when my sort of big corporate job that I actually didn't ever reply to a CC email. So if it wasn't to me, I just ignored it basically, which I'm sure was terribly inappropriate. But I was so overloaded. But then along came instant chat, and I noticed that all of my team were beginning to use instant chat and asking me if I would get on it, and I just basically said no. I'm not as bad enough having to get a lot of email from you lot. I'm not going to have instant chats either. And but what I've noticed now, and it's been some years since I was in that environment, that everybody is now on WhatsApp or the equivalent to WhatsApp,
Yeah.
and therefore it's a sort of immediacy. People want to speak to you immediately. And so you're going to be having all of these professional conversations all the time, which actually must be, you could probably just do that all day, I would
Yeah,
imagine.
if you want to. So I think it's an interesting observation. Let me reflect back on that a little bit. So you and I are old enough, just about to remember pre-email days,
Oh, yes, I remember them very well.
fondly.
I can
But
remember faxing my clients,
yeah,
asking them to do
yeah,
things.
exactly. I remember using a a fountain pen or an old typewriter, all that sort of stuff. So let's just look at the trajectory of this stuff. So there's no email, then there's email, right?
Mm.
And then there was um, the messaging. So where we've got to today is what you might call platform overload. You've got, if you want to communicate with me, you've got face to face, you've got email, you've got instant messaging, you've got the telephone, you've got WhatsApp. So all these layers of different ways of communicating, and it creates a number of problems. I mean, you've identified one, which is you can do this all day because it never ends. But also there's the incoming problem and the outgoing problem, which is this. So if I want to get in touch with Eddie, I go, right, I need to, wait a minute, shall I email him? Shall I WhatsApp him? Shall I write him a letter? Shall I send a carrier pigeon? What is the appropriate means for communicating with Eddie? So even before I can start communicating, I've got to think, how can I communicate? That's kind of cognitive overload. And then that's the outgoing problem. Then the incoming problem is, oh yeah, I must get back to Eddie on that thing he sent me. Oh, wait a minute, did he email it to me? Was it
Hmm.
a Teams message? Send it in the, so all of this stuff means that we have to do more thinking about communication than we probably want to.
Yeah.
And then the other problem is the urgency versus important thing, which is all of this stuff helps us do things quickly, right? So you think about the growth of technology from
Mm.
no email to all these channels we're talking about. All of these new technologies help us do things more quickly, but do any of them help us do things better?
Right.
Not really. I mean, that's the problem. I can't really think of a new technology
They
that
help
helps
us
us
to
do.
do more. I mean,
Yeah,
there's no question you can do more. I mean, it used to take me 40 minutes to send my client one fax. Now it
yeah,
probably takes me 40 seconds to send
yes.
an email.
So that's got to be a good thing. But I think there's another cost, which is, I think it's really hidden, but we pretend it doesn't exist, which is the fragmentation of our attention.
Right.
Right. So in your book, you say, I slightly disagree actually. So people do say time's our most precious resource.
Hmm.
I don't think time is the key resource, it's attention.
Hmm.
So the ability to control your time and deploy it in the most valuable way possible over the course of the day,
Yeah.
I think that's a superpower. And if we can get that, we're fine. And I think part of the problem with new technologies and our failure to manage them effectively is our attention is sliced up into tiny little chunks of 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So if you get 100 emails a day, which people might in a corporate setting, that means you're getting an email every, whatever it is, 5 minutes. And if you're being distracted because the pop up is there,
Mm.
or you feel you need to respond, or you feel that you need to check, or you need to go into Teams or Slack or whatever the hell it is, the only attention available to you is in little chunks of 5 or 10 minutes. And you
Mm.
can't do anything in 5 or 10 minutes. You can't do anything worth doing in 5 or 10 minutes. And I think this is the real impact problem in organizations, that people are constantly crazy busy but failing to manage their attention sufficiently effectively so that they can get to and execute the most important work, which needs 2 hours of thought, three
Yeah.
hours of thought, something like that.
I think that's very, very true. But also, if you think about it in terms of just going back to a normal interaction. So once again, if people had come to my office and they would kind of bang on my door and say, "Hey, I wanted to talk to you about this," they were fine with me saying, "I'm too busy. Please come back in an hour," or "I'm in the middle of doing some serious thinking about something important." No one really minded that. Although you had to still be disciplined about that, because if you
Mm.
let that happen, it would happen. And I think the problem with one problem with instant messaging is that it's a bit like that person stopping you in the corridor constantly, people firing messages at you. And there is a kind of expectation that you're going to reply quickly on instant messaging, I think. And there's also, by the way, the other thing I always think about it is like it doesn't end. So you kind of have this
Mm.
intense conversation on instant messaging, and then it's kind of stops. So does that mean the conversation's now over? It'd be almost like if we were to meet in the corridor, start talking intensely about something, and just carry on walking. It's
Yeah,
it's not very natural in a
it's
way.
not a natural way. It's not a human way of doing things.
Mm.
So, so I think this is. I'd agree with everything you've said, and I think this is really about managing expectations
Hmm.
effectively. So when someone comes and knocks on your door, you say yes or no, or can we talk tomorrow? But people also know the ground rules about that.
Hmm.
If I look through Eddie's door and he's got his concentrating face
Hmm.
on, he's not disturbing, right? But that sort of human cue is not available electronically.
Right.
So I think if we fail to explain what the rules of the game are, we're not going to work effectively. So let me ask you, second question today, Eddie.
Hmm.
What's your agreed service level agreement response time towards your clients?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't have a published one, and I know you do, or at least you have certain rules which uh, you know, I can let you talk about that. But I would say that my approach is that I feel like it's important for me to get back quickly and effectively. So I do ask all my clients to feel that they can talk to me via WhatsApp anytime they want.
Mhm.
But one of the reasons that that works is that they don't very much.
Yeah.
And and so what I think is important to say is that my system, which is really a very kind of I try to respond quickly, I try to respond anytime, but it works because I am reasonably not under massive pressure.
Yeah.
So if I had thousands of clients, I think it would be a system that wouldn't work. And I also think that it would be a shame if I couldn't do that. But then I think, in a way, that is kind of what goes on in the corporate world, which is I think that most people, I don't know about you, but whenever I get involved with anybody with a big job in a big corporation or even a small corporation, I always feel like they're constantly at like 120% of what they should be at. So they should be running at about 90%, a little bit of extra capacity for when
Hmm.
there's a problem or something urgent comes along that needs to be dealt with immediately. But as they're all at 120%, and some of them are at 140%, they have no capacity to deal with an urgent problem and get a lot of stress. And people get annoyed because they don't reply. So it's a complete lose lose.
Yeah, so there's really maybe two things there which we might dig into a little bit more. There's the responsiveness bit
Right.
and the capacity bit. I think they are separate but related problems. So on the responsiveness bit, as you mentioned, I do have a policy about this, and I always recommend to my clients just have a policy, what it is. And I asked you, I put what and said, what's your response time?
Right.
Um, and everyone says the same thing, which is I don't really have one, but
Right.
as soon as possible. So
Hmm.
clients say, oh, like that's sort of meaningless. I
Hmm.
mean, what is that? What, within a second,
Yeah.
within a day?
Yeah.
And I think it's worth spending some time thinking about it and then ways of managing that policy. So there are highly responsive jobs. So, for example, if you are a neonatal
Hmm.
nurse, right? Child struggling, please don't wait. If you are fire service, if you are IT support help desk, phone rings, servers are down, don't leave that till tomorrow. But most jobs are not highly responsive.
Hmm.
Most of the people we work with have thinking jobs, not responding jobs.
Right.
So you have to manage this tension between concentrating and communicating. So in that case, typically a response time might be, I don't know, 24 hours.
Hmm.
For most jobs, most thinking type jobs, maybe 24 hours. All you have to do is communicate that and say, look, I will promise I'll get back to you within 24 hours. In case of emergencies, phone me. And
Yeah.
this is what I've used this policy for about 10 or 15 years. And as you pointed out, people never phone. I mean,
Mm.
sometimes they do.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I'm on the way to a client meeting and something happens and the client has to cancel, I'd rather they phone me up and say, Matthew, don't bother, something else has happened,
Yeah.
rather than sending me an email saying, Dear Matthew, morning, hope you had a nice weekend, sun's out. Oh, by the way, the meeting's out. Right. So
Yeah. Yeah.
urgent stuff, act urgently. Non-urgent stuff, act in a more considered fashion.
I like
So
your idea that it's good to set the expectation
yeah,
because I think that if you think about it, like, for example, if I was to say, if you send me an email, I will endeavor to get back to you within 24 hours. I think that would be a good thing for me to do because sometimes it takes me a while to respond to an email. But yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense.
and then there's the second bit which you talked about, which is the relationship between load and capacity, and the difference is what you might call margin, right? We need a bit of wiggle room, and I think you correctly pointed out no one has that anymore.
Right.
But it's 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 good to have an understanding of what your workload is. So, third question for you today: how overloaded are you?
Yes,
Are you 5% overloaded? Are you 10%
by
overloaded?
design, not overloaded.
Well, that's a brilliant answer, right? But do you?
Happily, I am entirely responsible for myself. I am my boss, and
Yeah,
I have clients, but I don't have bosses. That's a very different thing. Nobody sets my objectives, and so therefore I am in control of myself, and by design. And there was a time 2 or 3 years ago when I became close to being overloaded, and I did make a conscious decision to begin to have less work because I was starting to
yeah,
not enjoy it and to feel
yeah.
oppressed by the inability to respond and do the things which I wanted to do.
It's an interesting thing. So you and I are similar in that we have maybe more control than many would have
Right.
over workload. Right? So I don't. I am my own company. You are your own company. I can say no to anything I want. But if I were a middle manager in a large organization, I might not have the ability.
Right.
But I think on this point, what's useful for people in that situation, not our situation, is to have an idea of the relationship between load and capacity.
Yeah.
And and when you ask people, no one really knows this. If you say to people, "How overloaded are you?" They say, "Oh, overloaded." Up to
Yeah.
here. They can't actually not precisely quantify it, but slightly quantify it. So what I ask people to do, just to get a feel for the thing, is, and you can do this, Eddie, after this call. You might be more overloaded than you think. I get people to write down all the things they could do now, everything they're working, roughly. I mean, just
Hmm.
on a piece of paper, spend 10 minutes, do that, and then put a time estimate after each thing. That'll take 20 minutes, that'll take an hour, that'll
Yeah.
take 10 minutes, and then add it all up. And what most people find, and you might find, but possibly not, is people have about 10 days worth of work on their plate
Right.
today,
Yeah.
right? Or one day to do it. So that's overloaded, right? You're 10 times overloaded. And that's true today, tomorrow, forever. But people aren't aware of that. So if that's the situation, say you are 10 times overloaded, you need really good systems for doing two things. One, for quickly finding and getting onto the 10% of your work that's most impactful.
Yeah.
And you need to be, this is the cognition bit, psychically set up okay to let down a large number of people. So
Yes.
which 90% of your job are you not going to do today? You know,
But you know what? It's a slightly different sort of angle on the same discussion. But in the book, you may have noticed an analogy that I like, which actually is really powerful, and I use it a lot with a lot of people. When I come across somebody new and we start talking, nearly always it begins with this idea of, I'm massively overloaded. And
hmm,
one of my questions is the analogy I use is the scoring goals in the soccer
yeah,
match. Have you seen that one? So
yeah,
it's like, you play extremely well, you're extremely sweaty, you feel like you've played the game of your life, but when the whistle goes at the end of the game, bizarrely everybody's booing. And that's actually because you didn't score a goal. And
hmm,
so even though you played really well, you didn't score a goal. So the question here is, what is a goal from your point of view in terms of what your job is, but also from, let's say, whoever you is measuring you, so your boss. And so if you work extremely hard and you respond to all these messages and do all these things, but somehow you're not actually scoring the goals that matter, it can be very counterproductive in terms of people's view of you and actually how well you work.
yeah. So I think that's a hot topic, and let me unpack it a little bit. So I did like the goals scoring metaphor. We looked fantastic on the pitch. We did great passes. It's a great team ethos, but we just failed to score a goal. It's going to
Exactly.
be an unsatisfying thing. So let's maybe look at two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of behaviors, how we set ourselves up to do our work. So everyone is busy. Everyone not only is busy, but can give the appearance of busyness. And you saw this quite a lot in COVID, when everyone was working from home suddenly. And there was a study done on it by some Dutch academics, and they called it, it's a terrible expression, voluntary, I think it was voluntary visibilizing activities, which is, I
Interesting.
can't actually do any work, but what I
Hmm.
have to do is give the appearance of doing work. And modern technology and modern workplaces are perfectly set up for this, because all I have to do is send out and respond to millions of emails and attend and be electronically visible at loads of meetings.
Yeah.
Now, which is great, except that neither of those things is the work. It's
Right.
just, even meetings are tools we use to do the work. So on the one end of the spectrum, it's really easy. So that is playing a game really well. That's doing great passes, running off the ball. That is that. But it's definitely not scoring a goal. So what are the things we need to do to score a goal? Well, I do a goal setting and execution workshop, which addresses this specifically. There's a few things. I can't do the whole thing, but maybe this. First of all, we talk about those three things. You need a planning and review horizon
Hmm.
framework. That sounds awful, but what I want is I want to plan top down
Right.
and review bottom up. Let me explain what I mean
Hmm.
by that. So every year I have 2, 3, 4 high level goals. What do I need to get done this year? That will inform my second level planning horizon, which is quarterly. So quarterly, what do I need to get done? We're in Q2 now to achieve my annual goals. That informs my weekly planning. This week, what do I need to do to achieve my Q2 goals? So there's a sort of hierarchical structure which atomizes my goals down,
Yeah.
so that every day I'm working on something which works towards a weekly goal, quarterly goal, annual goal. So that forms an almost mechanical link between my most important goals and what I'm doing today. And it overcomes to an extent the busyness problem. So that's the
Yeah.
goal setting bit.
Mm.
But also on the review bit, there's no point in doing that if I don't review effectively.
Right.
Right. So what I'm going to do is every day, at the end of every day for 5 minutes, review things. So this is another Stoic thing. Seneca says, hold each day up for review. So
Hmm.
let's have a look. How did I do? What went well? What went badly? What will I do better tomorrow? So we do that on a daily, weekly, quarterly, annual basis. So the people I know who are most impactful, which is about scoring goals, tend to have that sort of thinking, which is steer clear of busy work, focus on high value work, where high value work is anything I could do now, which leads me towards good outcomes on my higher level goals. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? So,
It does, and I think the clarity about knowing what I mean. Your friend Seneca, he was one who said, if you don't know what port you're sailing to, then no wind is favourable, which is quite nice.
yeah.
And I think that's in the book somewhere. But the I often find it surprising how people are unclear, not just about what the goal is, but what will be perceived by bosses, shareholders, whatever, as having achieved that goal. And so that there's actually also not just the element of sort of getting it done, but being seen to get it done, and people understanding that it's actually happened, and that you can tangibly say, we delivered this. Here's a bit of evidence. Here's some
Mm-hmm.
figures. Here's a report. Whatever it is, because I think, to your point, people spend a lot of time rushing around talking, and then there's an impression, well, yes, very good, this person works very hard, but what have they actually delivered?
Mm.
And maybe they have delivered things. So actually, it can be down to poor communication. So I just wanted to say one thing, that not in the COVID world, but in the old sort of world, that I remember someone once saying to me, "Oh, when you're in the office, you always need to walk very quickly and carry a piece of paper, so that it looks as though you were off to do something important, even if you're just going to have a coffee." But
So
it's kind of the same idea.
it is the same idea. So I think it's interesting, and just reflecting back on in the book, you talk about self leadership.
Hmm.
I think it's really interesting how the way that leaders work sets the tone, not entirely, but really substantially for all the people beneath them. So if I can again reflect on sort of two extremes where I've seen this work really badly. So I tend to get called in when teams are not functioning brilliantly,
Hmm.
and people are just a bit
Hmm.
useless when you come in and heal them. And I go and I spend a couple of hours with people. The people are fine.
Yeah.
It's just all the insane behaviours coming from the boss who phoned me up in the first place.
Right.
It's always the case. So let me give you, two specific examples. One, a small one on the sort of terrible behaviours bit, where I did work with an industrial group, and there was a big problem about meetings. Everyone was in meetings all the time, meetings
Right.
about meetings and meetings about why we didn't attend. It was never, it was the never endingness of it. And I checked the culture with the boss, and he said, "Look, Matthew, I mean, there just is an expectation here for my people. They should attend lots of meetings." I just thought that's really interesting. So I always say, attending meetings is not your job, but he's saying attending meetings is your job. I mean,
Right.
how is that possibly helpful? And then, so
Why are meetings always 1 hour?
why
It's
why are
like
meetings?
it's completely impossible that every meeting should be 1 hour, and yet somehow they always seem to be.
Well, so I think we have Bill Gates to blame for that because the default in Outlook is 1 hour.
Yes.
So just a quick thing on that. So something which I've done for a while, and I think it's quite helpful. Default to 45 minutes,
Yeah.
first of all, because
Hmm.
there's no difference in output, and gives you 15 minutes before the next one to pack down do 3 5-minute tasks. One, pack down the last meeting. Two, go to the bathroom, get a cup of tea. Three, open up the next meeting. So
Yes.
on that, that's a good. I do quite a lot of work on best meetings practice. It's a really simple thing. Stop this 1 hour meeting madness. So meetings is a plague, email is a plague. So, but to give you the example of really good leadership, modeling great behavior, I have an existing client I've worked with for 15 years, and he really models it. He is, he's always saying, what else can I do to improve myself, which I think is an interesting question. I say, honestly, not much. So really models best, so really non-reactive, like a great ship of state sailing through the day. They have it's an important business, it's
Hmm.
expensive, highly impactful, lots of commercial pressure, but he models calmness.
Mm.
Secondly, he blocks out about, I think he aims for 50%, but probably gets to about 40% of unallocated time in every
Yeah.
week. So this back-to-back meeting, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, is a recipe for disaster and misery.
Yeah.
And he says to his people, I don't do that. You shouldn't either,
Yeah.
which is a great message to send. Give your cells time to think, time to breathe, time to deliver your most valuable work. So I think there's maybe two examples there of extremes. And in the end, no one's gonna lie on their deathbed. Sorry to be morbid about this, going, thank the Lord I stayed on top of my emails.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. 100%. I
Keels
think
over
that's
people.
somewhere in the book too.
Is it? I
Yeah,
missed that.
in the last chapter, perhaps you
How is
didn't
it?
pay attention, you would get falling asleep by that point. But so a couple of things. One thing that I would definitely say about the contents of my book is that most of it is common sense, and very little of it is new, if you like, because this is what I find when I'm talking to my clients, which you're I think you're a little bit more specific in your area of work. Mine tends to be more general and
Mm,
kind of different types of leader I deal with different, sometimes different kind of issues. But that, for example, just the simple thing of making sure there's an agenda for a meeting, and as the leader, making sure that if there isn't one, you set one at the beginning of the meeting. So goal setting for the meeting, which is also important. But then something that I've used and suggested to people, which is remarkably helpful, is to label. So particularly these kind of team meetings that go on all day, right? And there's a series
mm,
of presentations and come along. So if you label them, so my suggestion is information, discussion, decision. So
mm.
information, somebody comes along, does a half an hour, you don't really have to say anything. It's all about them telling you about their project. Discussion, we're expecting you to have an opinion on this and to ask questions and for us to discuss it. And decision is actually we're here to make a choice about something. And I feel so often you're kind of sitting there listening to people waffling on about their project, thinking, when's this going to end so we can get on with the next thing? And that, if you think about it, is a great shame. Then you've got a certain amount of time in a day, and actually every minute of it ought to be used in some kind of sensible way.
Yeah, so I like the idea of labeling. I think there's almost a next level gain to be had from that, which is, do we need a meeting for this at all? So certainly
Right.
for information, if I'm just sending out information, why do I need to gather everybody together?
Mm.
Apart from it makes me feel incredibly important. If I'm a leader, why wouldn't I say, look, you guys value your time. I'm just going to send out the Q2 results, whatever it is, but there's no discussion or decision needed, but just get it out. So maybe an email might be good for that. Discussion. So weirdly, having shown my aversion to technology. It's just a discussion.
Mm.
Is a Microsoft Teams discussion maybe a better way to do it?
Yeah, it could
The
well
point
be.
being this, that there's synchronous activity and asynchronous activity. So synchronous activity is we're doing this together at the same time. That's a meeting. And asynchronous is we do this not together, not at the same time, but at times that suit us. So that
Yeah.
might be quite a nice thing to do by Microsoft Teams. But decision maybe,
Yeah, I
we need
mean,
to
there's
gather
also
better.
with team meetings, I think there's an element, it's definitely something that I used to encourage a lot, and I really encourage with my clients is to think about which junior people might come to the more senior team meeting and be given a 20-minute slot to talk about their
Mm,
project, which at the moment nobody is very aware of it or whatever it is. And so that would be, for me, that would be like an information type thing, where it's
yeah,
not
yeah, okay.
just for the team itself, but to allow people to talk about it. I think it's all very interesting. I'd like to just get back to the idea of the boss and the self-awareness bit.
Mhm.
And this is linked to my concept that I call mepathy, which is that sort of extension of, or sort of a slightly different angle on empathy, where you are very good at understanding your own impact if you have good mepathy. And I just feel that this idea that when you're asked, you know, how are you? So many people, oh, so busy, and sort of running from one meeting to the next. And so
Mm.
what they're doing is they're trying to give off this impression back to your boss, who sort of wants to exude calm. But so many leaders seem to me to what they want to do, either consciously or subconsciously maybe, is give off this impression of being fantastically busy, because I think is that a defense mechanism that people use?
Um, I think that's an interesting question. I think the answer is I don't know. I think it might depend, but
Mm,
to your point, I think we certainly see this. This is how work and technology has corrupted language.
right.
If I ask you how are you, I'd like to hear, well, very good. I had an interesting game of golf yesterday. The children have not murdered each other over the weekend. Yeah, I want to know actually how you are. But no one ever says that in the workplace. It goes, oh my God, I'm so busy. I'm running, I'm doing this. So when someone responds in that way to me, what they're saying to me is, I I fail to map out my work effectively. I don't prioritize. I'm behind on my communications, and I'm modeling all this behavior to my hapless employees.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think there's anything good in that. So maybe part of this whole thing is we have to just all calm down a little bit
Yeah.
and be a bit more honest about things. So any boss who says, I mean, I've never heard it, but if I said to a leader, "How are you?" and they said, I think I'm okay. I'm well prioritized. I think I've got a lot on, but I know what I'm meant to be doing. I've I've put in place strategies and practices for doing it well. It
Mm.
keeps my team calm. I'd go, wow, can I come and work for you
Yeah. Absolutely.
for nothing? But you literally never hear it. So there has been a corruption of language. Um, and I think just on that, just going back to what it's like working in the crazy world. There's some in your book you talk quite a lot about strategies for doing things. There's one of the problems is people feel unable to say no to stuff,
Hmm.
right? So the same people who would say, "Oh, so much on, I don't know where to start. I'm never going to get it done. It's never going to end," will say yes
Yeah.
to some new thing that arrives,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, and I think that's probably a function of a number of things. There might be a people pleasing personality, there might be a culture of we say yes to things, which I think is frankly unhelpful. But there are ways through it. So the problem is the more you say yes to stuff, the less good a job you're going to do on your existing stuff, and the more you're going to start saying no to yourself, right? Because you're
Right.
just going to work all the time. So a good sort of framework I have uh, I have clients with for dealing with that is not me, not now, not ever, as
Uh-huh.
three possible responses. So you say, Matthew, look, I need someone to write this paper. It's on organizational design. Do you think you could do a first draft? I might well say, look, so thing one, not me. I'd say, look, not really my area, but I got my friend Dave, who's a genius. Can I connect you to? So I don't say yes and then struggle with it. So that's not me. Not now. You say, Matthew, could you really have time to do this budgetary analysis? And so the not now response will be, because of current workload, these are all scripts. Okay.
Mm.
So because of current workload, I'm unlikely to be able to do a good enough job in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Would it be okay if we touch base on the 12th of May?
Yeah.
Not now. And then there's thing three, which is the hard one, which is not ever, which is you come to me and say, Matthew, I'd like you to write a book on leadership. And I'd say, look, honestly, Eddie, I could say yes, but I'd let you down. And
Yeah.
I'd rather not do that. Uh, please find someone else.
Yeah.
And what we find is, in organizations, people are terrified of saying these things.
Yeah.
No one objects. Don't mind. What people really object to is people saying yes and then not doing it, or not doing it properly, or not doing it on time.
Mm.
So some
And
boundaries are helpful.
saying I'm not doing it because I'm too busy doesn't
No.
somehow use it's so much better to use this kind of more objective language. Don't make it about you being busy. Make it about the fact that you're not going to do that job effectively in the next 10 days, but you could do it in 10 days if you'd
Yeah.
like to discuss that. I think I feel like so often things will be solved with not making it about you, make it about them or the thing. Do you see what I mean? And it can be a much more effective conversation.
Yeah. So let me ask you something. How do you build that into the mepathy framework? So one of the things that I think we both agree is unhelpful in a leadership setting is the sort of, it's all about me, the sort of
Hmm.
borderline narcissistic, however that manifests itself. And, great leaders, who was it? I can't remember who wrote Leaders Eat Last, right? They
Right.
worry about other
Hmm.
people. Was it Simon Sinek? I can't remember,
Yeah, it
something
might
like
have been him.
that. They worry about other people who serve to lead. They worry about other people first. How do you, when you see that in a person whose mepathy profile is not appropriate, how do you deal with that? How do you say to someone, it's not all about you, mate?
I think it's tough, because realistically, if you if you're dealing with somebody who has got those slightly narcissistic tendencies, and then obviously you've got to get past that for them to actually see it. And I think one way to do it is to encourage them to do like a 360 sort of study to actually
Mm,
say, hey, how about I go off and chat with some of your team about how things work? And because to your point, very often the conversation with a slightly narcissistic leader is my team are useless. So
yeah,
then if you say,
always.
well, let me go and talk to the useless team and I'll see what's going on with them and try and find out. Now, of course, one has to be careful because you can't go back to the boss and say, "Well, actually, it turns out that you're the useless one." You've got to be a bit more careful than that, a bit cleverer. But on the other hand, it should give you some ammunition to begin to open the discussion about. So, tell me about how do you go about managing
Mm,
your team? To what extent do you listen to them? To what extent are things set up in a certain way that allows people to give feedback and to talk to you about how you manage, etc., etc. And I think that, I don't think these things happen overnight. And I think that it's interesting. It's like part of your mepathy, part of your ability to understand your own impact is you've got enough interest in that in the
yeah.
first place. Do you see what I mean?
Which not
Um,
everyone has,
no, they
right?
haven't. A
They
lot
want
of
an
people don't.
external solution, not an internal
Yeah,
solution, don't they?
absolutely. And I think that this, I mean, I'm a big fan in general of the kind of leadership that's rather low ego, which
Mm,
is that it's about saying, look, the solutions to nearly everything we do should be with the team. And I'm the leader. My job is to help all that to happen by being useful and asking good questions and putting
yeah,
people together and helping people to resolve conflicts, but actually not by resolving it for them. That's something
yeah,
that people do. They step
yeah,
in and sort of fix something. So what tends to happen is that no one's actually happy. I mean, maybe if somebody's trying
yeah,
to win a battle and the other person comes and says, "Yes, I'm with them," okay, they're happy, but the other guy's not happy
yeah,
at all.
yeah. Net,
I
it's
think
not a game.
I
Yeah,
think that it's a very interesting subject, and I also going back to something you were saying earlier on, the thought that came into my head was this idea that whatever the leader does gives permission to the people below them to do that too.
mm,
So if the leader
yeah,
turns up to every meeting 5 minutes late, hot and flustered, and complaining about something, everyone in their team will do that. If the leader's not good at replying to their emails when they're important and that kind of stuff, then the same thing will happen. If the leader's not doesn't come to the team meetings or when everybody's gathered together for a drink once a month or something, then people will not turn up. On the other hand, if the leader does do all those things and shows that they think they're important, they have tremendous power. I think leaders have tremendous power.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that goes back to in your book, you talk about above the line, below the line. You talk
Hmm.
about accountability, ownership, responsibility above the line. And I think there's a I don't know which of those boxes it would come into, but there's something about discipline as well,
Right.
isn't there? Which is, principled, here we turn up on, here this is how we work.
Hmm.
We turn up to meetings on time, we keep our promises, we don't take shortcuts, we map out the work effectively. So that sort of language, I think, you're right, it doesn't get solved quickly, but it doesn't get solved at all if you don't have the leader talking that sort of language. And actually, I think of the great people I've known who are personally effective and great leaders. They all talk the language of discipline. It's much more of
Yeah.
a sort of a military.
Yeah.
We This is how we work. This is how we execute
Absolutely.
type approach.
I do genuinely think that. And interestingly, when you talk about military, um, if you look at the old sort of rules in the military back in the day, I'm talking 200 years ago,
Hmm.
right? Things like on a Navy ship, that the captain would be on their own in a big cabin and would need to be invited to come and have dinner with the officers. Otherwise, they basically eat on their own. And you stop and think about it. Gosh, that sounds terrible, right? On 2 years out on a ship, and but it was done very, very carefully thought through. That if the captain becomes too friendly with the officers and
Yeah,
spends every night drinking port, the ship will not be a happy ship.
yeah. You
Whereas
can't
with
command.
keeping that
Yeah.
separation, and you know, one of the things that I realize, and it's probably the key, frankly, to what I do, is that most leaders are quite lonely,
Mm.
and yet that is where I think coaching can be great because probably I would think nowadays in the modern Navy, the captain probably does have a coach who is not one
Yeah.
of those
Yeah.
officers that are
Probably.
down there. I bet the system's still the same. And I think that you're absolutely right that these ideas, essential ideas of discipline, turning up on time, kind of behaving in a certain way, behaving with respect, I think they are fundamental to success. I really do. But once again, if the leader does tend to give off those vibes, and everybody, if it's like we all have to be on time because the boss is always on time.
Yeah.
That is that's already a great step for people. And
So it's
and
in,
what sorry, and also even just the things like the way that decisions are made. So if you are the kind of boss who makes a sort of snap decision, we're doing it because I said so. The people who those direct reports will do the same.
yeah, and you just have a reduced quality of decision making as a
Exactly.
result.
Hmm.
So how do you, let me ask you another question. How do you see effective decision making in organizations happening? I mean, it cannot be a total democracy, right?
No, I
We
don't
can't.
think so.
So one of the things I see quite a lot is here, people say, here we're driven by consensus. We make
Mm.
consensus. My consensus takes a really long time to
Yeah.
achieve.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure there's any guarantee you get a better decision through consensus than through, quite a quick rule of thumb approach. 80/20 might be a good way of making most decisions.
Yeah.
What do you see about effective approaches to managing that?
So I think that you said, I can't remember what I asked you, but you said it depends. And I'm going to say the same thing. And I think it
Yeah.
does depend. And I think that that's part of mepathy as well, which is having the ability to be flexible. And I think that there are a lot of cases where it is important because if you take a decision for the people, two or three people are unable to decide something and they come to their boss and you just take a decision, you have let them off the hook to a certain extent in
Yeah.
terms of making the right choice. And you are not necessarily, I mean, I was in a situation where I worked with a lot of lawyers, and the lawyers knew much more than me. So they would say, you need to decide. And I would say, well, I can't decide. You have to decide because you know far more than I do about
Yeah.
this. So that the leader's job can be to get to a decision, not necessarily to take it. Right.
Ah,
And,
yeah. That's an
but,
interesting distinction. Yeah.
but also that there are definitely moments when the leader needs to say, okay, I've listened to absolutely everybody. I can see this is extremely difficult, but I think this is what we should do. We do this. And I need everybody now to get behind me and agree that's what we're going to do. And, that may not be perfect,
Mm.
but I think there's a lot of analysis paralysis as well in businesses.
Yeah.
People are longing, excuse me, for the boss to make that decision. Come on, boss, make a decision.
Yeah.
And I think that, so I think it does depend. I don't think it's a good idea for bosses to be those kind of people, bum, 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 making decisions all the time, because they're going to make some bad ones. But at the same time, you can't be constantly pushing the can, kicking the can down the road, hoping that somehow it's going to be easier tomorrow, because it's not.
Yeah. There's that's interesting. There's an interesting approach I've seen. I think it's Jason Fried. I don't know if you've read any of this stuff. He talks about disagree but commit. So
Right.
let's have a discussion. We will not get so getting his thing is look, getting to consensus takes forever.
Yeah.
Getting everyone to agree, the the cost of getting there more than outweighs the benefit of having made a decision. So look, we're just going to have a quick decision making process. We're going to everyone tell Eddie. Eddie's going to own the decision.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone write to Eddie or communicate to Eddie what they think of the thing. On Friday, Eddie's going to make the decision because we can't go on much longer without a decision. And then after that, we're going to commit. So even if we disagree, we're going to commit. So
Yeah.
you, Dave, might not agree with the decision, but I'm expecting 100% commitment to
Yeah.
Eddie to make this happen. And I will do the same. If I, as the leader, disagree, it doesn't matter.
And I think if you've got a highly functioning team, that should work. I
Yeah.
mean, this is all linked to this area, what I think is called adaptive leadership. Certainly, Ronald Heifetz, he wrote about adaptive leadership, and
Mm.
there's these distinctions between the adaptive leader and what they call like the technical leader. So one of that um, the adaptive leader allows conflict. Okay, so very
Mm-hmm.
often what people do is they close down conflict. So two people are disagreeing in the management meeting, and they will say, "Okay, well, let's take this offline and talk about this later." But that doesn't actually happen. They don't. That conflict
Yeah.
doesn't get resolved.
It's
So
just
that,
avoided. Mm.
and then another thing is protection of people. So there is a business issue that needs to be resolved, but hey, we're going to keep this to ourselves, we're not going to talk to anybody about it, but actually exposing people to the conflict situation, saying this is what we're facing, let's talk about it, see who's got a good idea. Because I think a lot of leaders think, oh, if I tell people, they're going to be scared and this is going to happen. That's one of the reasons I think that in many companies they're not very open about the finances, because there may be things about the finances that are a bit uncomfortable, or we're
Yeah.
still relying on money from that investor and that sort of stuff. People would much rather know the truth, and they don't, they're not just going to walk in, resign, and say, "Well, I hadn't appreciated that we were being, still supported by that investor, so I don't want to work here anymore." They're
Yeah.
more likely to be thinking, now I realise we've got 6 more months and we've got to do that.
Yeah. Better
So
to be informed. Yeah.
I think people can take a lot more than some leaders kind of think that they can.
Well, so I mean, I think there's maybe two further thoughts on that. First of all, it's slightly infantilizing
Mhm.
to either protect your people from the reality or to uh, somehow snuff out any disagreement. We're all adults, so we're not going to build an effective team by infantilizing. The second thing is, if you're a leader, what you want to be doing is working on the next generation of leaders.
Yeah.
So, quite apart from modeling the best behavior, you need to permission to disagree and work their way through it and become the leaders they need to be to support the goals of the organization.
Yeah.
There's two good reasons why you don't want to sort of duck away from this sort of stuff.
And actually, just to sort of round it up and bring it back
Hmm.
to your kind of work, that absolutely I agree. And I think that when you go higher up in an organization, you far less are you doing a job and far more you are being a leader. And you need, and that is often a problem, which is the fantastic salesperson who's got the best figures of all time becomes the leader of the sales division, but they're not actually very good at being a leader. They're very good at being a
Hmm.
salesperson. And so the becoming a good leader is an evolution of your skills working in business that some people struggle with, but you really really have to work at it, and that's all part of empathy. It's about your self-awareness of, am I good at this, am I good at leading? And a big part of that is the stuff you work on, which is setting a good example with your productivity, with the way that you work, with the time that you allow yourself. I mean, back to what we were saying before, if you give yourself 3 or 4 hours a day to think, then you're giving people permission to give themselves 3 or 4 hours a day to think. And if you say we should all be in meetings, then people will all be in meetings. It's pretty simple.
And no work will ever get done.
So I think that
Agreed.
these things are extremely joined up,
Hmm.
and that there's no question that a, a boss who is extremely busy, extremely senior, and yet manages to get through everything, reply to the important messages, set clear ideas of when they're going to respond, give clear messages, take decisions when they need to. I mean, this is a dream boss, isn't it?
Dream boss, and you'll have a dream boss and a calm team,
Yeah,
which is what you really want, I think, in the
yeah.
end.
And you know what I do think as well, that although it may sound, I don't know, a bit sort of twee or something, but trust. If a boss can create a situation where the team around them trust them, and clearly the boss trusts the people who work for them, so much can be achieved, because not everything always goes right and not everybody always makes the right choice. But if you live in a trusting environment where you can make mistakes and you can be clear about, I've got this thing coming out next week and I'm absolutely in a panic. Can you talk to me and help me? And the boss says, of course, let's sit down and talk about it. Whereas if you can't admit that to your boss, if you can't
Yeah, so
admit,
it's about the human side of
it's
showing vulnerability, asking for help, all the rest of it.
yeah. I mean, we are
Absolutely.
humans. No point in getting away from that. So, Matthew, we've been talking away for a while. The time has shot by.
It
I've
has.
really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that the people watching have also found it interesting. I'd like to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Eddie.
And I want to make sure we finish on time because you need to get off and do your next thing in
I've got
a
to walk the dogs in
highly
5 minutes.
productive way.
It's been
Excellent.
great, Eddie. Thanks. And for any watchers, if you haven't read Eddie's amazing book, Where's My Free Lunch? Highly recommended. Available at Amazon and all good bookstores everywhere.
Excellent. All
I haven't
right.
got a book, but I will have one day.
Good talking to you, Matthew. And we'll talk again soon, I'm sure. Bye.